those of you who don't know much about the university, it was founded in 1857, and then the war sort of intervened, and so classes didn't get started until 1868, and so there are lots of old buildings on the university and lots of potential for ghosts to be around. The way I got into collecting ghost stories is I was archivist at the university for 28 years, and we got this new building. So we were going to have a nice Halloween party, and I was like, well, we'll tell ghost stories. And then I thought about it, and I'm like, well, I don't really know any. Maybe two. And I know they're not true, so I put the word out over the internet, and I have since then gotten stories on over 70 places in and around Sewanee. So I'm just going to tell a few of these stories. The first one, I got an email from an alum who was there in the 70s at school. And on her third night in this dorm, McCready dorm, she went to let one of her friends out, and in the reflection in the mirror, she saw behind her a woman in a purple dress with long, dark hair. And she turned around and nobody was there. So then at the Halloween party, which this is 30-something years later, there was a woman who was there with her son trick-or-treating, and she said, well, I'm a custodian at the university, and I don't like to go to McCready because there's a ghost of a girl in a purple dress with long dark hair. And that's the first one I got corroborating evidence on. And most of these were told to me firsthand. So I guess people are going to ask me if I believe in ghosts, and I think I have to say yes, because I don't believe these people are wrong. But I have no idea what a ghost really is. The next story is about a dorm called Courts, and I'm sorry I don't have pictures of all of these places, but there was a girl who, one of the students was asleep in her bed, and she got awakened, and she saw this tall figure standing over her roommate. And she thought it was a student that was going to assault her roommate, and so she was trying to figure out how she could call the police without calling attention to herself. And she moved slightly, and all of a sudden the figure had jumped or flown over to her and was sitting on her chest and pushing her down into the bed so that she could barely breathe. And she spent a very long minute hoping she wouldn't die, and then all of a sudden it just vanished. She spent a pretty sleepless night after that. And it happened to her again about 2 weeks later. There is a building, if you've been to Sewanee, you may know where Fulford Hall is. It's a big white Victorian house, and it was the Vice Chancellor's residence for a long time. It was built in 1889, so it's been there a pretty good while. And the people who were, it houses the admission office and financial aid and things like that. And so the women who work downstairs, they hear in the back hallway all the time a shuffling around and kind of see this person they call the Shadow Man. And so there were 2 staff members in the admissions office who used to bring their dogs to work, and their dogs would not go through that hallway. And then while Fulford got a renovation one year, they actually found a human femur in the wall. And they don't know how it got there. The only thing we can think of is that it used to house medical students when they had a medical school there, and perhaps one of the medical students was responsible for that. So they got rid of the femur and sent it off. And so I went back and I asked the ladies if they still heard the shadow man. And they said, yes, it's still there. So who they think it is a Spanish teacher from the university named William Waters Lewis. And so I looked up his obituary and discovered that he died from a fall at a commencement reception. And the commencement receptions were always held at the Vice Chancellor's house, which would have been Fulford Hall. So we like to think that it's William Waters Lewis who is shuffling around in that hallway. There is a building that they just tore down named Van Ness Hall, and it was built as a silviculture lab in the 60s. And then when those people moved out, they turned it into the music practice rooms. And so there was a guy there who was practicing, and his girlfriend was with him, and he was practicing and they were talking, and they saw this shadow go past the window. And it made this frothing sound. It wasn't like a wolf or a growl or anything. It was a very weird sound. And they kind of looked at each other and was like, did you see that? And they didn't think too much about it, and he went back to practicing. And then a few minutes later, they saw the shadow again. And at that point, the guy started improvising this really weird piece on the piano. And his girlfriend was like, what are you doing? Please don't do that. And he just got wilder and faster and in his improvising. And she didn't know what to do. She tried to pull him away from the piano, and at that point he started screaming and screaming, and he wouldn't stop screaming. And so she didn't know what to do. It was late at night, so she pulled him out to the car and drove him around to the chapel. Meanwhile, he was screaming and flailing the whole time. And she pulled him up to the chapel steps, and when she opened the door, he stopped, and he didn't know how he had gotten there or what had happened ever since the shadow went by the window. But he refused to go in that room ever again. And it happened to another person, not quite as dramatically, but somebody who sort of got possessed like that. So it'll be interesting to see when they build the new dorm in its place if this spirit is still hanging around. So, there is a house on the Sherwood Road that is probably the oldest house in Sewanee. It was built in 1840. And it has a log cabin inside it and then a house built around it. And it belonged to a family called the Green family. Well, the people who live there now have heard footsteps in the driveway coming up behind them. And then when they turn around, there's nothing there. But then one of the daughters was asleep in her room upstairs, and she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a girl in a white nightgown standing in front of her. And she had long, dark hair. And they looked at each other for several seconds, and then she just disappeared. And then another time she had a friend over to sleep with her, and the girl appeared, and all of a sudden the bed rose up rose up off the floor about 2 feet and then dropped her down. And that scared them pretty much, and they went downstairs to sleep. And so the family discovered a grave across the street. There's a cemetery called the O'Dear Cemetery across the street from their house. And in the Green family, there was a little girl named Mary who had died young, and that's who they think this is. I don't know, have any of you heard of Rivendell? Yeah, Rivendell is a house out on the Natural Bridge Road, and a long time ago, the people who owned it ran a camp there called, it was affectionately called Camp Whoopee. And there are lots of remnants of that camp left there, but there are 2 houses there. One is a big stone house, and one is a little wooden back house. And the wooden back house is rented out. Well, the person who lived there woke up one morning, she was being awakened by something tugging at her feet. And when she opened her eyes, there was a little girl with blonde hair in a blue dress asking her, "Where's my mother?" And after that, she appears to her every so often and asking where her mother is. And so we never found the story behind that, but there she is anyway. So I went home, and my daughter was there with her, one of her friends, and I was like, well, I just got a story about Rivendell. And her friend goes, "Oh, is it the girl in the blue dress with long blonde hair?" I was like, "How did you know that?" And she said, "Well, I had a friend who used to live in that house, and she used to see her all the time." So, I thought I would talk a little about Rebel's Rest, even though it's gone. Who knows what's going to happen. There were 2 ladies who were spending the night there. It was the university guest house, and they had a very lax way of getting people in. They would just leave keys out for them, and they come by themselves and nobody there to really check them in and stuff like that. But anyway, these 2 women were staying there, and they were the only 2 ones in Rebel's Rest that night. And the next morning, the one who stayed in room C, they stayed next door to each other, she went to the manager and she said, "You know, I was awakened no fewer than 8 times last night by somebody knocking on the door. And every time I went to the door, there was no one there. But one of the times I went down to the kitchen, and I saw a woman with blonde hair and a long white nightgown floating around in the kitchen." And that's the same room that the custodians won't go into alone because too many weird things have happened to them. Now, the woman in the next room didn't hear a thing, but she was awakened by loud snoring all night. Now, the biggest thing that they hear about Rebel's Rest is people partying late into the night, and seeing people in 19th century clothing, and also little children on the stairs laughing and playing. And then the other thing is, one of the managers used to live in Rebel's Rest, and she would see the figure of George Rainsford Fairbanks, who was the owner of the house. She saw him milling around all the time, checking out and seeing what was going on. So now that Rebel's Rest is gone, it'll be interesting to see what happens in its place. Now, the next story I have is a true story. I mean, not a ghost story. the ghost stories are all true. Well, are all told to me by the people they happen to. So there was a girl, and she was babysitting, and as she was playing with the child, she spotted this life-size clown doll standing in the corner of a room. And it was just kind of creepy. The eyes were kind of hollow, and I seemed to just always be facing them and all, but they kept playing, and she made dinner, and she still couldn't get that clown figure out of her head. But it was still there, and finally, when she had to take the child upstairs to go to bed, she had to pass it. And she could have sworn that the eyes followed her while she went up the stairs. So she helped the little boy brush his teeth, and when she came into the bedroom, there was the clown standing by their bed, just looking at them. And she screamed and ran downstairs and locked herself in the kitchen and called the police, and the police came and led him away. Hoffman is a dorm on campus that used to be a hotel in Alabama. And when the hotel went out of business, they took it down, brought it up on the train, and put it up in Sewanee. And after that, it's burned once, and they've still used the same stones to rebuild the building. So, and it was the first real dorm in Sewanee. They used to have boarding houses before then. So in Hoffman, there was one room where a lot of small things happened at first. They kept hearing a sound like hands rubbing together, but it'd be right like next to your face, or like something rubbing against the wall. And that happened off and on. And it was really hot in the room. Their cookware was hot to the touch, and chocolate would melt in their room. And the more they laughed that it was a ghost, the worse things got. Now one day, one of the students was taking a nap, and her roommate was there too. And all of a sudden she was awakened by this loud slamming as the front door slammed open, and she could hear somebody running down the hallway, coming straight for their room. And right when it was supposed to get to their room, their bookshelves flew out of the wall like this. Nothing fell off of them or anything, but they just flew out of the wall. And they just didn't fall down. And her roommate saw the bookshelves move, but she never heard the pounding footsteps or the door slam. And so over the next few weeks, that happened again a little bit. And so they started telling their friends, don't make fun of the ghost. But one of the guys who was there did make fun of the ghost, and right then one of their unopened bottles of champagne exploded. So another thing that kept happening was they heard furniture moving above them, in the room above them, all the time. And they were like, why are they always rearranging their furniture? And so finally they got sick and tired of it, and they went upstairs to ask. And when they went upstairs, nobody was there. And when they came home, a couple of hours later, both the roommates had been in the library studying all day and night, and they said they had never rearranged their furniture. Then those people moved out of the room, and another person moved in, and she discounted the idea of a ghost being in that room. But at the end of the semester, she was talking with somebody on the phone and saying how the people before had said that the room was haunted and how it was a crock. And at that point, her computer turned off and turned back on, and right in the middle of her paper was written, "Fool, fool, fool." And so she changed her tune about whether or not there was a ghost. In Hoffman, there actually was someone who died. His name was Gareth Moultrie Ward, and he came in, and one of his friends had just bought a gun, and they were admiring it, and the friend took out all the bullets and put it down on the bed, and then he picked it up to admire it, and it went off, and there was still a bullet in the chamber, and it killed the student. So we don't know if that's who it is who's haunting that. But recently I've had people come up to me and tell me that they've heard the rubbing sound and the furniture being rearranged in the attic, and they actually went up to the attic and there wasn't any furniture there. So I'm sure many of you have seen the cross. You can see it from the highway. It was built in 1923 and begun on Armistice Day, and everybody in the whole town took part in the ceremony. So people bringing the rocks up and providing music and providing food and all of that. So it's in memory of all the people who have died in wars. But sometime in the 1950s, and this was told to me by the woman it happened to, there was a woman and her boyfriend and a couple of other people, and they went out to the cross to, park for a while. And before long, they saw this car coming straight. The crossroad is real straight, and it has like 3 hills like this, and you can see all the way to the end of it. So they saw these headlights coming, and it went down the first hill and up the second one, and down the second one and up the third one, and then all of a sudden they were gone and it started over. And after it did that a few times, they were like, I think it's time to leave. And so they got in the car and started off, and all of a sudden there was an old vintage car right in front of them, and it kind of ran them off into a ditch a little bit. But then when they looked around, there was no car there. So that one was told to me by 2 different people. Another thing that happened at the cross was these 2 guys decided to take a late night walk, and they were walking down, and one of them saw a little dog trotting next to his friend, and he reached down to pet it, and his hand went right through the dog. And he was like kind of surprised, and he turned to his friend, and his friend was white as a sheet, and he said, "Did you see that dog?" And his friend was like, "No, I was looking at the man who was standing right behind you." Tuckaway is a dorm that used to be the Sewanee Inn. It was built in 1930, and before that there was a boarding house on the site that was a very popular one. So Tuckaway is built so that it could have been an inn, which it was in the 30s. So the first thing that happened in Tuckaway is the one that has the most stories attached to it. I think there are over 20. I won't tell you all of them. This guy had a room that was right off the common room, and he was in his room studying, and all of a sudden he saw a person in 19th century garb floating into his room, but only from the torso up. And he ran out into the common room, And then he started thinking better of it. He's like, I don't think I should tell anybody. They'll just think I'm crazy. And he had just about convinced himself that he hadn't seen that when somebody came running down from upstairs saying they had seen legs disappearing into the ceiling. And the building that was built before then was built a little bit lower than Tuckaway, so it's possible for that to have happened. A lot of people have talked about seeing people milling around there between about 7 and 10 o'clock in 19th century garb, always from the torso up. So one year there was a student who lived there, and he was sitting around talking to a friend, and all of a sudden the window just flew open. And he went over to close it, and he had some trouble, and he was like putting all of his strength into closing the window, and he finally got it closed, and he locked it, and after that it flew open again. And then one of the people, I guess this is the first story that I got on Tuckaway, there was a person who was a student there in the 70s, and this one room, room 306, is the room that everybody has trouble with. And I've actually had parents call me up and say, what am I going to do? My student has been assigned to room 306. And I'm like, well, it's not up to me. But anyway, this room had a study room and 2 bedrooms. And he was in the study room studying by himself, and all of a sudden he heard this large whoomph sound coming from his bedroom. So he went in to check, and he looked around, and he finally looked in the closet, and all of his clothes had fallen off the hangers, but the hangers were perfectly still on the rods still. Now, since then, that room has been reconfigured into a double. And if you go up there, which I have gone up there, you can tell that the doorknob has been replaced. And the story behind that is there was a student who lived there who was going to a formal, and when he went to leave to go to the formal, he couldn't get out of the room. Now, you can't lock yourself into these rooms, but he couldn't get out. So he pounded on the door and yelled and screamed, and finally the proctor came, and the proctor went and got his master key and tried it, and it didn't work. So they went downstairs and got the head resident, and she brought her master key up and tried it, and it didn't work. And so they called the police, and the police didn't want to really knock down the door, so they tried taking out the hinges, and they still couldn't get the door open. And so they called the physical plant services, and they came up and they tried the doorknob. The whole apparatus fell out onto the floor, but the door still would not open. And finally, they just kind of broke through it. And after that, they replaced the doorknob. Well, a couple of years later, the proctor heard this pounding and knocking and said, help, let me out. And somebody was locked into the room. And his key would not open it, but the head resident came up and opened the door with her key that time. The next year, when they were doing room assessments at the beginning of the year, they had finished that, and the head resident gave them all to the proctor, and the proctor checked through them, and there was one missing. And guess which one it was? Room 306. And then at registration, when they passed out keys and everything, there was one key missing. Room 306. Another resident had his clothes thrown all about the room, and a lot of them have seen figures behind them in their computer screens, and they turn around to look and there's nobody there. And one guy woke up and saw a figure actually sitting at his computer as if he was using it, and he got up to move. Well, he moved a little bit, and the guy got up and just walked right through the wall. And one night there were two students, they were roommates, and they were going to bed. All of a sudden they heard, "Good night," and they each thought the other one had said good night, but neither of them had actually done that. Another person woke up to have a dark figure sitting on his chest with its face inches from his, and not a very nice way to wake up from a nap. Another person bought a television, and the volume wouldn't stay down. It would just turn up at random times. And finally they just said, "Stop turning the damn volume up." And at that point the volume went down to normal, and they didn't have any trouble with it after that. I think I'm gonna, since I only have a minute, I'm gonna tell you my story. I was talking to my sister on the phone. She had lost her husband, and so I was talking to her every day, and just to, you know, make her feel better and everything. And I was sitting there with my computer on, and I looked down, and there was a smiley face and a KL. And my brother-in-law's name was Keith Lafferty. And so I figured he was looking after her. I have more, but I think time's up, so thank you for listening.